All right, so I have three summaries here from class, 1, 2, and 3. They're a little bit different from each other, and I figured we'd talk a little bit about each. All of these are from the Smollett 2002 paper, so we can talk a little bit about this. So summary 1, the paper offers a semantic account of the exclusion of Latin verbs from particle constructions in English. This is a very good introductory sentence because, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Highlight in color. Because you're explaining that there's some meaning account when it comes to Latinate verbs. What would be nice to see here is when you say from particle constructions in English, it would be nice to have an example in that first sentence too. Just even adding something like saying, uh, or this paper offers a man account of the exclusion of Latin verbs from particle constructions in English. Um, Explaining why 8 up is grammatically acceptable, but consume up is not. So by putting in this bit of information into the first sentence, you're also pretty much explaining why certain words can't use the construction, and you're showing what the construction is. It's consume up versus 8 up. English owes its lexical richness to the double heritage of Romance and Germanic vocabulary. This can be included as a point. Latin verbs borrowed from French or Latin and early modern characteristics exhibit unique characteristics. So here's a supporting point. And the exclusion has been characterized as arbitrary or based on formal properties. So, like, we do have some supporting points here, but in terms of the overall summary of the article, this bit, points 1 and 2, this is really extra information that doesn't necessarily need to be included if you don't have the space for it. Here we have some more information, which is pretty much just explaining that first point in more detail. So it would be useful when you say arbitrary or based on formal properties to describe what those properties are. Because otherwise, you're not really adding much to that initial sentence. Okay, you have another main point, which is pretty much a repeat before. So there's an aspectual component. This is good. Native speakers are redundant. You have history. You have obligatory aspects. So what this has done right, and this is, how do I highlight this as good? Assume the green highlight here. This is quite good. So instead of going into detail about the different types of, um, you know, whether it's delimited or undelimited or non-delimited, it's not explaining the background information as to what those are, but rather connecting the ideas of delimitation to the Latinate verbs and the particle constructions. So although in the paper itself, section 3 is a bunch of background information, it's being used to push a point in section 4. So you can think of section 3 as the setup for section 4, where section 4 is the main argument that supports the overall goal of the paper. Okay, and then as a conclusion, we get some repetition, which in a conclusion, it's fine, especially for a summary, but we do want to make sure that we can tie it directly into everything we've talked about. So the spectral properties of Latin verbs can be used to differentiate them from other verbs that allow particle combinations. For this concluding sentence, what we want to do here is we want to be a little more specific because we added details in the article. Well, in the article summary so far. So in the article summary. So based on what you wrote so far, your conclusion, you want to tie it back to the introduction with some of the stuff that you've written. So can be used to differentiate them. Well, how? You just want to specify how as a concluding sentence. So for summary 2, we see slightly different introduction. So in the article, Why You Can Eat Up an Apple But Not Consume Up an Apple by Rebecca Smollett, it is stated that Latinate verbs cannot take on certain particles, whereas certain Germanic verbs can. So in the article itself, this is fine in an intro because you haven't seen the argument yet. But in terms of a summary, you already know the conclusion of the article. Okay, this is used as a reminder, as a way to convey the main arguments. So be specific in this case. So, like, you're saying they can't take certain particles. So, like, in this case, uh, what's the reason? Any examples? You do have an example below this, so maybe I can remove the any examples part. But uh, in this first sentence, we could be a little bit more specific at this point. What I would also say is for this, we don't want to put all of this information at the front of an essay. It's just a little bit too cumbersome to put the article title and the full name, so we do a different convention. What we would say is just small at 2002 stated that Latin verbs cannot take on certain particles. Because in the reference section, you'll have um, your reference. So 2002, and then whatever the other bit of references was. In fact, if we go back on Canvas and I just go to the syllabus here, I do have the full bit right here for small at R. So this would be the reference. So in the end, in the reference, we would put this in the reference section. And then we have our information on what the paper is. So if this is being indented correctly, I can't quite get it to indent correctly, but with APA, every line after the first should be indented. So you do the example, Thomas mixed up the flour versus Thomas combined up the milk and flour. Yes, that's great. They serve the same purpose. So this information here, embedded affixes, you're almost getting to the main point here. You're almost getting to the main argument. But this isn't quite the main point. The main point was illustrated in summary 1, which is the whole point of the paper is you can't add the prefixes to Latinate words because the Latinate words already have that particle. Sorry, I said prefix. That particle. They already have the particle built into the word. So we are missing that bit of information. So if a sentence is undelimited, if it is delimited, blah, 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 that is correct, but that's not the main point. The main point is that it's built into the word or it's not built into the word. And that's how it connects to Latinate verbs. Okay, the author could have gone into more detail describing the arrow figures as opposed to using them as examples. Yeah, so that's a fair critique. It's not a very, it's a critique that goes into the writing rather than into the content, and both types of critiques are fine. Typically in upper division, and when you get more confident with your linguistic abilities, you want more content-based critiques, but to start out, a writing-based critique is totally fine. Now, summary 3, I have something in full sentences, which again is, I always say if you can write something in full sentences in class, you're doing incredibly well, since this type of writing is not expected in a 30-minute period. So the Smollett article, again, we just want to make sure that we put in the date as a citation. That way we know if we Google which article it is. Examines the use of particles in Latin verbs like combine and consume and Germanic verbs such as mix and eat. So just because you have the word particles mentioned in here, I do want to see some sort of particle mention in this first sentence, because we just see combine, consume, mix, and eat. But again, we're talking about particles here, so we should have something in the beginning that at least explains what a particle is. The furthermore here doesn't quite make sense, but again, with quick writing, it's expected to make a few errors, so I do want to get rid of that. When a particle is added to the verbs, it indicates an endpoint that delimits the event. That is correct. The following test can be used to determine whether or not a verb can be delimited. Okay. In 1a, the verb does not have an endpoint. In 2a, it does, compared to 1b. Okay. So this bit right here, if I highlight this in blue, this is all talking about delimitation and meaning. So this could be a little bit confusing from a summary point of view based on the intro here. You have Smollett argues that because Latin verbs already contain an aspectual component that delimits the verb, the addition of a delimiting particle is ungrammatical. This actually fits a little bit better up here. Why do I say right up here? Because this is the main argument of the paper. So this bit of information is explaining the argument and it's showcasing an argument, specifically with the delimitation. And then you have some examples here, and overall there's some issues. The number of examples is redundant. Okay, so we do have some more information here, but we do want some restructuring because, again, this is an article summary, so we don't need to follow the exact order. We know what the conclusion is already, and we want to showcase that conclusion. If you read this paper a year from now, your summary, you should be able to get the main gist and arguments of this paper just by reading the 1 or 2 pages you write. So if you put the main argument up at the top, you're not creating a mystery for yourself. If you have just this and then you have your main argument further down, it's like you're writing a mystery novel. And in academia, we don't want to write mystery novels. We want everything to be upfront and clear and obvious. So these are these 3 summaries. Again, they each have their strengths and weaknesses. Summary 1, a little bit of unnecessary information if there's some space that you need. And the conclusion, a little bit more work. Summary 2, just a little bit more specificity in your intro and kind of missing one of the key points. And then summary 3, just some reordering here. So that's it for this little review video of what we couldn't cover in class today. If there's any questions, you can always email me. Hopefully you can see how to do the references here. I can't quite, just doesn't want to let it work. But essentially you would have this, you would have no indentation on Smollett. You'd have an indentation on the second and an indentation on the third. It is not working nicely.